can't be alive in no time but now. It's just another shot to the heart. It's just a short shot in the dark. It's just another place in the stars. Wonders on every side. Life in marvelous time. Life in marvelous time.
Hello, my name is Anson Osaka. I'm the founder of New Possibilities. And today I want to talk about a couple of things. The first thing I want to talk about very briefly is my reaction to the George Zimmerman verdict. The second thing I'll talk about, which will be the primary focus of this video, will be the president's statements about Trayvon Martin. Now, if you follow my blog or you watch my YouTube station, you should know my position on the George Zimmerman verdict. I was, deeply disappointed and shocked, but I wasn't surprised. And, for further details about how I feel about the verdict, I recommend that you read my blog article, and I will provide a link in the description to this video. Now let's talk about the president's statements regarding Trayvon Martin. I thought that the president's statement was very important. And, before I even begin talking about the content of his statement, I just want to say that I commend the president for having the courage to speak out about racism and the whole issue of the Trayvon Martin case. He could have easily remained quiet. He could have just stood by his initial statement. And I'm glad he went further. I'm glad that he expanded upon that original statement because frankly, I was disappointed by that statement. But since I knew that Eric Holder and the Department of Justice were investigating the George Zimmerman case, I held back my criticism. Because at the end of the day, actions are more important than speeches and rhetoric. So, the mere fact that he has Eric Holder on the case spoke volumes to me. In my eyes, that was more important than any statement that the president could have issued. But this statement is very important, and I just want to highlight some of the key points that the president made in his statement. One of the things that the president did, which no other president can truly do, no other president before him could do, and that is he truly identified with Trayvon Martin. He said that he could have been Trayvon Martin 35 years ago. And many of us identified with that statement. And he said, before this statement, he said that if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. And the reason why these statements are so important is because many of us identify with Trayvon Martin. He's not just a single individual who was murdered. He represents each and every one of us. He represents every black man. He represents our brothers, our nephews, our fathers. He represents us. He represents our future. So each of us identify with him. And since many of us have been the victims of racial profiling, we see ourselves in Trayvon Martin. And I'm glad that the president had the courage to speak out about racial profiling. Because every day, African American men experience racial profiling. We experience it when the police stop us because we're black. We experience it when we are followed in stores, as the president pointed out in his statements. Many of us have experienced some of the scenarios that the president laid out, like the scenario of someone clenching their purse in the presence of a black man, assuming that our skin is a badge of criminality. And it's just unfortunate and sad that here we are. We have a black president, and frankly, that means nothing in terms of changing a lot of the attitudes and perceptions about African American men and boys. So I commend the president, because essentially what the president did is he not only addressed African Americans' concerns about the George Zimmerman trial and the case, he translated our experiences. He communicated our experiences to the larger society, to white America, to all of America. He wanted the world to understand why African Americans are so outraged about the verdict in the George Zimmerman case. Here we have, as I've said in many of these videos, we have an innocent young black man, or boy at that time. He was close to 17 in age. He went to the store to buy Skittles and iced tea. And on his way home, he's minding his own business. He's not breaking any laws. He's not doing anything wrong. He's in a place where he has every right to be. He's on his way home. And a man named George Zimmerman, who wasn't even a police officer, he automatically racially profiles Trayvon Martin. He assumes that because he's a black boy with a hoodie on, that he's up to no good. He assumes that he's crazy. He assumes that he's on drugs. He assumes that he's trying to break into somebody's home. And because of those false assumptions, eventually a young boy is dead with a bullet through his heart. And at the end of all of the uproar, at the end of all the days of trial and all the controversy around the case, at the end of the day, the killer walks free. And the people are right to be angry. The people are right to be frustrated. And I'm glad that the president was able to communicate that frustration to America. I'm glad that the president talked about disparities in criminal justice, disparities in the criminal justice system in terms of sentencing for drug offenses and as far as the application of the death penalty is concerned. We know that African Americans don't use or sell more drugs than anybody else, but we are convicted more often than any other group of people. We are targeted more often than any other group of people. And I'm glad that the president had the courage to mention that during his statement. I commend him again for making those statements. Also, the president talked about the problem of black on black violence. As he mentioned in his speech, African Americans are more likely to be killed by other African Americans. And we all know this. And this brings me to an important point. Ever since this whole controversy over the Trayvon Martin case has been raised, you've had all these conservative commentators talk about black on black violence all of a sudden. All of a sudden, these people claim that they care about black on black violence, when in reality, all they're trying to do is to divert attention from the key issue, and that issue is justice for Trayvon Martin. Also, they are using this black on black violence issue to perpetuate ideas, negative ideas about African Americans, ideas that we all of our problems are a result of black pathology. And that's one of the important points about the president's speech. He talked about the larger context in which inner city violence occurs. There's an economic context to the violence. If someone is deprived of opportunity, if they are deprived of a decent education, if they are deprived of jobs, of opportunity, they are more likely to sell drugs. They are more likely to engage in acts of violence to protect their drug market. And we know this, I mean, the statistics bear it out. Most of the people that are convicted for drug offenses or that are incarcerated, many of them are uneducated. Many of them have not completed high school. Many of them, most of them, if not all of them, but most of them have not gone to college. See, education is a remedy to the problem of inner city violence. And that is a key issue, and that's something that a lot of these conservative commentators ignore. They just want to focus on the end result instead of the root cause of that result. And I'm glad that the president talked about those causes. And I find these conservatives' concern about black on black violence to be disingenuous. Because before this Trayvon Martin case, you can't find any of these people talking about black on black violence in a sincere way. You can't even find any of these people participating in one Stop the Violence rally. Conservative commentators like Larry Elders and others, I asked them, what demonstrations have you participated in to fight the violence in the inner city? And I reluctantly use the term black on black violence because I think that we should be about condemning all forms of violence and ending all forms of violence. The fact of the matter is, African American violence is taken for granted. When we are violence in the inner cities, nobody cares about that for the most part, other than the communities, as I talked about. For decades, African Americans have been holding marches and vigils to stop the violence. Rap artists, for instance, have put out songs about stopping the violence and the self-destruction. For decades, we have raised the issue. But nowadays, it seems as if the larger society doesn't care about inner city violence. The larger society is more concerned about the new towns and the other mass shooting tragedies than they are about inner city violence. So I think that we need to focus on ending violence, period. Now, the president made another very key point that many of us have been stressing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, race did play a major role in this case. If Trayvon Martin was named Jeremy and he was white, if he was a white teenager, I doubt, and most of us doubt, as the president said, that the outcome and the aftermath would be the same. We doubt it. First of all, George Zimmerman would not have thought that a white teenager wearing a hoodie was suspicious. He wouldn't have thought that. That's just a fact. Because, and the reason why I say that is because when George Zimmerman called the police all those times, he mainly called the police I think with one exception. On each occasion that he called the police, the people that he was reporting on were black people. He saw black people and he automatically assumed criminality. So first of all, George Zimmerman would not have stopped a white teenager under similar circumstances. Second, if he did stop a white teenager for the same reason, and he killed that white teenager under the same circumstances, George Zimmerman would have been arrested immediately. There would be no need for demonstrations or protests because he would have been immediately arrested. And no one would be having an intellectual debate about how complex this case is. No one would be talking about stand your ground. None of that stuff would even be relevant if Trayvon Martin was a white boy named Jeremy. And that's just a fact. He would have been convicted right away. And as the state said during their closing arguments, if George Zimmerman was black and Trayvon Martin was white, we wouldn't even be having a discussion about this. There would be no need to write about this issue. There would be no need to do videos about this issue. Now, one of the important points that the president made during his statements is he didn't just talk about the problem. He laid out 4 different areas that he thought action needed to be made in. The first point that he talked about was the Justice Department training police on the state and local level about racial profiling and how to address that problem. And I think that that's key. And I hope that this is not a moment for the president. I hope that there is follow-up, that there is action that goes along with this rhetoric. And if so, that'll be a major step forward for this nation if we had a program in place to train these police departments about racial profiling. Because if you look at what's going on in New York, it's a shame that African Americans are being stopped and harassed by the police, when most of those stops and frisks don't turn up any evidence and don't result in any convictions. It's a waste of resources and police time. So we need to have more effective policing in the communities. And perhaps the Justice Department can train police on how to be more effective. And that would be great if the president actually follows up with this. A second point that the president makes, he talked about the stand your ground laws and just about how these laws, as Eric Holder emphasized during his address to the NAACP, these laws don't prevent violence. They help essentially escalate violence. And when you combine those laws with loose gun laws, you're creating a recipe for disaster. You're exacerbating a problem that already exists. There's already a problem with racial profiling among the police. But when you give everyday citizens guns and you give them the right to interpret these laws in a way that escalates violence, you're creating a recipe for disaster. So I'm glad that the president raised that issue. Another point that the president made is about making efforts to bolster and reinforce black boys in a way that shows them that the society values them and it wants to invest into African American boys. Because the bottom line is this country needs all of its citizens to be as productive as possible. We can no longer afford to let our inner cities just decay and destroy themselves. We have to value every single citizen equally. If many people were dying in any other city, like in Chicago, how African Americans are dying at large numbers, I think that our country would make it a top priority to address that problem. If we can try to make peace in the Middle East, if we can try to negotiate peace in Afghanistan between rival groups, if we can try to intervene in Syria and Libya and all over the world, why can't we intervene in Chicago? Why can't we intervene in Detroit? Why can't we intervene in Baltimore City to bring about peace in our neighborhoods? And finally, the president talked about soul searching, the need for a communication or conversation about race. He talked about how he didn't think that these conversations were very productive on a political level. And he said, well, we need to have these conversations in our churches, in our families, and in our workplaces. I understand that, but I think that there's a role for government. I think the government can play a role in that conversation as well. And I think that if a white president, Bill Clinton, can convene a group to discuss race, then why can't the first African American president do the same as well? I think that it's time for the president to lead that conversation instead of avoiding it. And I'm glad that he's helped spark the conversation with this initial statement, the statement about Trayvon Martin. It is very helpful and is a step in the right direction, and I commend him for it. Now, there was a final point that I wanted to make about the president's video, and that is, well, the president's statement. I'm creating this video to make a statement about the president's statement. Well, one thing that the president said was he said that basically law enforcement is a local matter and a state matter. And he basically implied that it's probably unlikely that the Department of Justice will be able to take any action against George Zimmerman. And I think he was kind of hinting at that in his statement about the Trayvon Martin case. And I think part of it is to lower expectations so that we don't assume that the Justice Department is going to act and take action. And, that concerns me. And I read an article that talked about the legal hurdles in terms of the Justice Department taking action against George Zimmerman. And I find it disheartening. And, there's a real prospect that we may face a situation where nothing happens to George Zimmerman, where the federal government, doesn't take action. They don't charge him with anything. And I'm real concerned and troubled by that. It doesn't set right with me. Because if George Zimmerman can get away with killing an African American boy who's minding his own business, then none of us are safe. None of us.
Can't be alive in no time, but now it's just another shot to the heart. It's just a short shot in the dark. It's just another place in the stars. Wonders on every side. Life in marvelous time. Life in marvelous time.